In the next few slides, we will discuss the essentials of what every woman should know about her own menstrual cycle and the critical role that her cycle plays in the physiology of nearly every bodily system. Once we have an understanding of how our menstrual cycle functions, we can then understand what it means when cycles change and how these changes affect athletic performance and overall health. So let's dig in. There are four main players in the menstrual cycle. The first is FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. It is secreted by a gland that lives at the base of the brain called the pituitary gland. It is secreted at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, which is the start of menstrual bleeding. Its purpose is to initiate the development of an egg for ovulation later in the month. The second hormone is estrogen. We hear a lot about this hormone because of its central role in female physiology, and we will discuss this in just a few minutes. But for the purpose of its role in the menstrual cycle, estrogen is secreted by the ovary as the egg develops. Once the egg is mature, the estrogen levels peak, which tells the pituitary gland that the egg is ready for ovulation. The third hormone is LH, or luteinizing hormone. This hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland in a quick 24-hour spike and stimulates ovulation or the release of the egg from the ovary. The fourth hormone we'll talk about is progesterone. This hormone is secreted by the ovary after ovulation to ready the uterine lining for implantation. As you can see here, these hormones are the means of communication among the pituitary gland, the ovary, and the uterus. In the next slide, I'll show you how this conversation comes together. The conversation begins with the pituitary gland. As I mentioned in the last slide, the pituitary gland secretes FSH. FSH is the way the pituitary gland communicates to the ovary to tell it that it's time to make an egg. The ovary hears this message and says, oh, it's time to make an egg. So the ovary develops the egg and communicates back to the pituitary gland by way of estrogen to say, hey, I made an egg, we're ready for ovulation. The pituitary gland hears this message from the ovary by way of estrogen and says, oh, we have an egg, let's ovulate. So the pituitary gland tells the ovary to ovulate by secreting LH, or luteinizing hormone. The ovary hears this message via LH and says, time to release the egg. So ovulation happens. Now we need to bring another player into the conversation, and that is the uterus. So now that the egg has been released, the uterus needs to be notified of this, because if there's sperm in the fallopian tubes that comes together with the egg, that means a pregnancy may be established. So we need to let the uterus know that pregnancy could happen. And so the way the ovary communicates this is by way of progesterone. So the uterus says, oh, wow, an egg's been released. If there's sperm in the game, pregnancy could happen. Let's get the lining ready. Then say pregnancy happens. Now the baby comes into the conversation and needs to let the ovary know that implantation has happened, because that progesterone is going to sustain that pregnancy until about 10 weeks or more than 2 months of gestation, at which time the placenta develops and it can produce its own hormones to sustain the pregnancy. But for the first 2 months, the pregnancy's very existence depends on the progesterone that is secreted by the ovary. So the fetus comes into the conversation, lets the ovary know, hey, I'm here, keep cranking out the progesterone so that this pregnancy can continue. Now say pregnancy doesn't happen. So the ovary is waiting for that message that there is a pregnancy, and say that message never comes. About 10 days after ovulation, the ovary doesn't get that HCG, that's the human chorionic gonadotropin that the fetus secretes. Doesn't get that message. The ovary says, okay, nothing's happening this month. Progesterone levels then decline because the ovary is like, well, let's start over. So it stops producing progesterone, and that's when menstruation happens. So this is an example of the hormonal conversation that occurs when the normal menstrual cycle is happening. And this conversation is happening among all these players month after month after month. Now, this conversation is divided into two phases. The follicular phase, which is the first half of the cycle up until ovulation, and then the second phase is the second half of the cycle following ovulation, and this is the luteal phase. The luteal phase ends with the first day of menstrual flow, which marks the start of the next cycle, thus the next follicular phase. So what this slide illustrates is how the hormonal conversation that we just reviewed in the last slide lines up with these two phases. Now, as I mentioned previously, estrogen plays a central role in nearly every system of the body. This slide shows just a few examples. Scientifically, we know that estrogen functions in these tissues because estrogen receptors, or the antennae that receive estrogen signals, are found in all these tissues. So the presence of antennae in a tissue shows that the tissue is waiting for an estrogen signal so that it knows how to function. Physiologically, we understand the wide-ranging function of estrogen throughout the body because when women are transitioning into menopause, which is a time where estrogen levels are declining and becoming erratic, women experience a wide range of unpleasant symptoms that can include hot flashes, anxiety, depression, bone and muscle loss, joint pain, digestive disruption, among others. And so these wide-ranging symptoms demonstrate the wide-ranging function that estrogen plays in so many systems of the female human body. So the take-home message here is that because estrogen is a central player in the normal menstrual cycle, changes in the menstrual cycle impact our global physiology and thus our athletic and physical performance. Now, we just discussed how changes in the menstrual cycle impact the physiology of so many bodily systems. But what's also true is the reverse, and that is when there are changes in our physiology, this can impact the menstrual cycle. The evidence for this is when a woman is overtraining and underfueling. This results in a stress on multiple bodily systems, and this stress impacts the menstrual cycle. So many times when women are overtraining and underfueling, or even experiencing job stress, life stress, menstrual cycles can change. And so the menstrual cycle then becomes a reflection of what's happening in the physiology behind it. So to recap this reciprocal relationship, when the cycle changes, as it does in menopause, these changes impact physiology. And when the physiology is affected by stress or other processes, the physiology changes impact the menstrual cycle. This part of the equation demonstrates the menstrual cycle can act as a vital sign for what is going on with our physiology. So to conclude, let's summarize the important points. Number one, because estrogen targets so many tissues, menstrual cycling impacts performance. Number two, the menstrual cycle also serves as a vital sign that tells us about the status of our health and physiology. When menstrual cycles become irregular or disappear, this is a sign that there has been a change physiologically. And when physiology is suboptimal, performance will be suboptimal.